Is this thing on? I think so. Welcome everyone. Welcome to Ready for Mistakes. It's been like God, 2 years, I think, if not over 2 years since the last episode of the show. Um, for those of you that are tuning in for the first time, welcome. I'm glad you're here. But if you're, someone who's listened before, welcome back. I've been doing a lot of thinking about um, bringing the show back and restructuring it in a way that works for my schedule and everything, and allows me to do something that I really got a lot out of. And when talking with folks uh, about the show, I've always heard such positive things about what these conversations did, and that's always the goal, is that um, having these conversations is not only beneficial for me personally to learn about my peers and learn about their work, but also to have a conversation that is open and transparent about the processes and the ideas behind this work, and getting folks familiar with contemporary photographers that I personally feel deserve more attention, of course. And yeah, these conversations are always so fruitful for me, and that's always my hope, is that they are for others as well. And I realized, as I was doing this kind of restructuring, figuring out a schedule and system that works to kind of get a consistency going for the show, including doing seasons rather than just kind of sporadically publishing them. I realized that there was one conversation that I had back in 2024 that I never actually published. This conversation was with Louis Ableidinger, who is a photographer from North Dakota. And we talked about his project, Driving Through Flyover Country, which was a book published by Subjectively Objective a few years ago. And it's a really, really great conversation. It was interesting listening back, editing this conversation from 2 years ago, because I had since forgotten a lot of the questions that I asked him. So it was almost like I'm listening to it with fresh ears. And that was a really fun and interesting experience to finally put this conversation together 2 years late. But alas, it is finally hitting the internet so that folks can get to know Lewis's work, specifically this project. Lewis has been doing a lot of other things recently. If you're following his social media, you've likely been seeing some of his more recent work. So yeah, this conversation is a great time. I'll quickly read off a bio about Lewis so you can get a little bit familiar with who he is before we get into the conversation. Louis Ableidinger is from the small town of Kensal, with a population of about 163, located in the east central part of North Dakota. Early on, he developed an appreciation for the subtleties of a region that most people dismiss as boring, and in 1998 he picked up a camera for the purpose of photographing old grain elevators. This led to day trips and finding ghost towns with old elevators, eventually starting to point his camera at other subjects. Soon it became a nearly obsessive passion to visit every corner and every town in the state, just to see what's there. Lewis graduated from Minnesota State University at Moorhead in 2007 with a Bachelor of Science in Graphic Communications and a Bachelor of Music in Jazz Performance. Though photography was never his primary focus at MSUM, he continued shooting and was able to take a few classes that helped broaden his photographic horizons. Since 2008, Lewis has had a day job as a locomotive engineer and continues to pursue photographic subjects, and is currently a resident at Harvey, North Dakota. So yeah, that's a bit about Lewis. I'm sure a handful of y'all have already been familiar with his work, but if you're not, I highly recommend you take a look at his portfolio, take a look at his website for Driving Through Flyover Country, as that is the crux of this conversation that we have today. But his social media does have a lot more recent work that looks very, very exciting to see where it all goes. So definitely keep tabs on that. Anyway, I'll stop yapping here and I'll let you all get into this conversation between me and Louis Ableidinger. Hi, Louis. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Really excited to talk about you and your work. So let's get rolling into things. So
I'll have you tell me about how you got your start in art and photography as a whole.
When I was a lot younger, I had quite an interest in railroads, railroading trains. There were several magazines that were being published at the time, and I had always just assumed that the photos were all made by like staff photographers. And one day I somehow found out that no, actually most of them are submitted. So these are just guys with a hobby of photographing trains and contributing, and then not only that, but they'd actually pay you if they printed it. So I thought I could try that. There's nobody really shooting in North Dakota. So my parents had a Canon AE1 that they didn't use. Got some film, got the camera, and started taking pictures of trains stuff at first. I wanted to shoot more than just what I saw in my hometown, so started traveling to other nearby areas to look for new photo locations, and started noticing interesting stuff in these small towns, and started kind of shooting that, because I kind of came to realization that these towns were changing, that things were disappearing. So I thought, well, I should photograph it while it's still there. So got better at photography, did train stuff, did small town stuff. Then I went to college at Minnesota State University, Moorhead, and I had a professor named Wayne Goodmanson, and he's a landscape photographer kind of in the style of new topographics, man-made landscapes. And he kind of introduced me to the work of like Robert Adams, Frank Golke. And this was photography like I had never seen before. And it kind of broadened my horizons as far as what photography could be. I should mention too, this is a little out of order, but for high school graduation, my parents gave me a book called In Search of Lake Wobegon. For those not familiar, Lake Wobegon was the fictional Minnesota town that Garrison Keillor invented for his public radio show, Prairie Home Companion. Each week it was the news from Lake Wobegon. So he teamed up with a National Geographic photographer named Richard, I'm not quite sure how you say his last name, if it's Olsenius or Olsenius, Richard Olsenius. And he went and photographed central Minnesota, kind of where this Lake Wobegon was supposed to be based, these small towns in central Minnesota with a 4x5 camera on black and white. Very documentary style, and I'd never seen anything like that either, which kind of changed my perspective on photography. Like, you can do more than just document, you can add some artistic value to it in, light composition form. That book kind of changed my direction, and then learning about Frank Golke and Robert Adams, Stephen Shore, kind of further changed my perspective.
The rabbit hole began.
Yeah. So after college, stagnated a little bit on photography for a few years. I was working a lot, just getting out once in a while to photograph whatever, but I decided I should start getting back into it and see what I could find, and I discovered the work of Alex Soth, Brian Skutmott, Joel Sternfeld, which I was surprised I hadn't seen his work before. And that kind of reawakened this interest in going further with photography, and really went down a rabbit hole and started getting a lot of books and decided, well, I should get more serious about photography. And that was, around 2012, 2013, and it's been ongoing since.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that kind of like lull period. So since you grew up in a really small town of less than 200 people, how do you think that growing up there had affected your relationship with the place as well as the landscape around it?
Yeah, very small. I tell people my graduating class was only 7 people, and one of them was a foreign exchange student from Hungary. My family farmed, so I lived part of my childhood in town and part of it out on farm. So you'd spend lots of time out in the landscape in a tractor, all day, which I think kind of is what tied me to the landscape, because be going back and forth over, a quarter section of land all day, could watch the light change. You could see the subtleties in the landscape. And then over seasons, it would change too, from spring when it's just bare dirt to crops growing up, changing in the fall, getting covered in snow. So just being immersed in the landscape like that so much of the time is what I think connected me to the landscape part. Growing up in a small town really connected me to those types of places. It wasn't an outsider, I was part of it. It's interesting because everybody knows everybody else, for better or worse. The better part is it does create a good sense of community. People help out, ask what you're doing, how your family's doing. They'll come together if something needs to get taken care of in town. So it gave a real insight to what it's really like in these small towns. It's not just a desolate place where there's nothing to do. There is a life to it, but it's not maybe readily apparent the way it would be in a big city.
I grew up in my youngest years were growing up in a town called Stoughton, Wisconsin, and that was like 12 grand. So only 6 times bigger than what you had? No, was 6 or 6? I'm not good at math. There's a reason I do art. So moving back into your college experience, I saw that you had received your bachelor's degree in jazz performance, which was a bit of a surprise to me. I often listen to jazz while I'm working on my photography. Kind of puts me in that good mindset for play as well as relaxing. So do you think that your experience in jazz has influenced your visual art practice at all?
Mostly the music kind of serves as a soundtrack while I'm out looking around. Whether there's any subconscious thing that affects it, I'm not sure. I don't know if there's any direct influence, but I definitely see a lot of parallels between the two, especially like documentary style photography in jazz, because you're both kind of improvising with what you have to work with. There's kind of a structure, but you're working on the fly to make something out of what's there and working with what you have. It doesn't always work out the way you planned, but sometimes that surprise is what makes great jazz music or great photography. And both require a lot of practice, lots of hours in the practice room to learn how to improvise on the spot, and taking lots of bad photos to learn how to take one good one.
I like to think of the studio as a practice room, and then the out there, I guess you could consider it a kind of perform. Yeah, there's a lot of people that consider the act of taking photos as a performance. That's a whole other rabbit hole to go down there, but it's a fun one. Yeah. So with your initial start in photography being, of course, the trains, but also into grain elevators later, both of which are staples of the Midwestern landscape, it's still often seen in much of your photography. Do you ever look back at those first photos of either trains or elevators for any kind of like beginner's wisdom or something like that?
Yeah, usually when I look back, I think, what was I thinking? Why did I think this looked good? There's a few pictures I remember get it, because of course shooting on film back then. I remember getting them back and think, wow, these are great. And you look at them now and it's like, well, they're underexposed, the composition's off. But every once in a while, I do come across a picture I took that actually is really good. I look at it and think, what happened? Obviously, I made this when I didn't really know what I was doing, but something must have clicked. Maybe I overthink things now sometimes. In a way, you kind of want to go back to that time period where you didn't really know what you're doing and everything was interesting, and not overthinking things. Trying to push myself to have kind of that spirit, but still pay attention. put what I know into practice. Yeah, there's something to be said about not overthinking photography like we did when we started.
Yeah, when I moved out east to Massachusetts, I wasn't sure if it was going to be like kind of that wonder of being on the East Coast, colonial landscape and everything. I wasn't sure if it was going to be super easy to make new work or if it was going to be super challenging. It wound up being the latter because I would, going into an MFA program, I was especially overthinking. Everyone that knows me and how I work well, that boy, do I overthink everything these days. And like these days I'm, working on lots of stuff in the background, but I can't get myself to go any further than just taking the pictures because they just sit in the archive and just, it's got to have a home, and just doing things like that. So I can totally relate to the overthinking aspect of things.
So yeah, when I out driving around now, I've been to so many places in the state, and I always think, well, I wish it was 20 years ago when I was visiting this for the first time, and everything was interesting, and so it's trying to strike that balance between that joy of seeing everything new, but being able to use experience to make something good out of it.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And so, like, now fast forwarding to more recent work, you did have your recent publication of Driving Through Flyover Country, that is really hitting on a subject that I think, of course, myself and many past guests of the show can relate to, and that, you know, the flyover country landscape, basically anywhere between the coasts, in like the biggest picture sense of things. The work was made on, 4x5 view camera, but this book is not quite small. It's around 97 photographs. So tell me about the genesis of this project and how the making of it got rolling.
Well, Midwest has always been my home. We took family vacations as a kid. We were kind of weird in that we wouldn't go to the mountains of the West or up to Lake Country in the Northwoods. We would go to like Iowa, where my parents would go to a whole bunch of antique stores.
Yeah.
So, Iowa, Minnesota, South Dakota, all these small towns that nobody else would really go to on vacation, but it made me develop an appreciation for it. And so once I got older and could take my own trips, I would tend to go to these same places to find whatever weird, unusual thing might be in the town. So it was just kind of a natural extension of that to say, well, I should make a whole project out of this, because there isn't that much work done in the Midwest photographically, by comparison to the Southwest or the West or Northeast cities. The body of work is quite a bit smaller. So it made sense to do a project like that because it hadn't been done that much. Yeah, this is around 2015. I kind of got the idea to do this. I'd been shooting digital for almost 10 years prior to that, but had started in film, 35 millimeter in medium format. For this, I kind of wanted to slow down. Plus, I wanted a camera that could capture a lot of detail, which in 2015, there were some high megapixel digital cameras, but they're pretty expensive. So
even today.
Yeah, they've come down, but yeah. So I had a 4x5 that I'd used a little bit, but kind of was just gathering dust. So I thought, pull that out and use that on a project, kind of like some of my other photographic heroes in their large format. So I just started using my vacation time to go out on trips, pick a state or an area, kind of a general area I wanted to go to, and see what I could find to photograph. You mentioned it's got quite a few pictures, and it was a slower process, but I took a lot of photos.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sure if it had been digital, it would have been in the thousands and thousands, but even for 4x5, it was quite a lot. But the upside was it gave a lot to work with for the edit. Well, it is a slow process. Towards the end, I was getting pretty good at getting it set up and everything ready to go really quickly if I had to.
Yep.
Just the advantage of working with something so much is you learn it.
So I remember that seeing the cover photo of flying over drive-through country, yeah. Driving through flyover country, as one of the images that was included in Subjectively Objective's Vernacular of Landscape, and that little zine/book was one of the first contemporary bodies of work, curated bodies of work of specifically contemporary landscape. Of course, I had seen Stephen Shore's and I've seen new topographics work and everything, but this was the first like new stuff that I've seen back 2017 or 18, whatever it was. So how did your perspective on this kind of work change after you made this body of work, the flying through drive-through country?
It sounds like a documentary of fast food restaurants.
Honestly,
The way it kind of changed is When I started, it was all backed up. The camera was backed up, like broader landscapes, broader views of the city or town, even the people. One of the early pictures is that ice fisherman by himself out on the lake. As it progressed, I started to think about I need to get closer to some stuff and I need to find more details. Yeah, I needed more details and little things that I happened to start noticing in the landscape that kind of tied the story together. So you had a broad landscape, but then you'd have a detailed shot of an interior, and it would all kind of tie together. So yeah, the perspective went from very broad to narrowing in on small things, just to help round everything out.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good natural kind of progression of things. I feel like when any of us kind of realize, oh, I have a project here, I want to start a project, to kind of start big and then narrow in. And I think that is a really, really effective way for a lot of folks to do their thing. Like one of my favorite interiors that you have is what I assume is a abandoned house, the blue wall, and then the curtains just kind of hanging over the window. Going from something like that to on your website, the previous picture of the house in the background with the dirt road driveway, those two just starkly different distances. Were these all shot with the same lens across the board, or did you swap things out a little bit?
Let's see. Yeah, at the time, I guess I had two different lenses, 150 and a 210. Mm-hmm. So they're pretty close.
Yeah, relatively speaking.
You get a little bit more compression out of that 210 and a little bit tighter. I think there's probably pretty evenly split between the two. Yeah. I remember a lot of times thinking, oh, I need the 150, setting up and then going, shoot, I need the 210. You gotta go swap it out.
Yep. About the book, there's this balance of portraits and landscapes that we've talked about, of course, and then the periodic interiors. I've always struggled with interiors and trying to do more of them lately. So whenever you were in either people's homes or even the abandoned ones, but especially the ones that are people's homes, what was the interaction like, and did any of the relationships with them persist after the images were shot?
Yeah, there's a couple pictures from people's homes. One is a little bit deceiving. It's a picture with a chair and the flowery wallpaper and the pictures on the wall. Mm-hmm. And what this was a sod house in North Dakota made out of sod bricks that people lived in, I think, until the late 60s. And when they moved to a nursing home, I think is what happened. The family decided just to leave the house as it was when they last lived in it and basically turn it into sort of a museum. And it's just by itself out in the middle of nowhere, and the door's unlocked, and come in and make sure you close it when you leave.
Yeah.
But the house looks exactly like it did when they lived in it. So it's a bit deceptive.
Yeah.
That it's, I could just go in there and spend as much time as I wanted and nobody thought anything of it because nobody else was there. It's not staged. It's not like a staged museum house. This is what it looked like. This is their pictures, their handmade blankets. The other picture that was made in somebody's house, it's the picture with a bunch of antique tools on the wall.
Yeah.
Yep, it was actually in a guy's garage. And if you notice, the clock on the wall has no hands. And it's because he's retired, so he said time doesn't matter. So his clock has no hands. But anyway, his name was Jerry, and he lives in Pleasant Hill, Illinois. Like I spoke about earlier, finding the guy to show you around town and get you in. Well, Jerry was the guy. I happened to be photographing an old feed store in town, and he drove up and it's like, what are you doing? That could go one of two ways.
Yep.
But luckily it went the good way. I said, I'm working on a photo project in the Midwest, and this building looked interesting. And that, it tells me all about the building, and says, you should come out to my farm. I do woodworking. I do this. I can tell you all about the area. Went out to his farm, and he told me, or showed me his tool collection, and, real proud of it. I asked if I, take a photo of it. Oh, yeah, get a picture of that. That's great. And ended up making a picture of him too. It's paired up with that photo in the book, the guy with the giant hornet's nest and the millstone. But I've kept in touch with him and been back 2 or 3 times to visit him. Took some additional photos too that are not part of this project, but yeah, I've kept in touch with him. Been 5-6 years now, and gone back to visit. And otherwise, most of the other interiors are businesses. I thought that was pretty important to document too, because sometimes the interiors of these buildings are more interesting than the exteriors.
Yeah, exactly.
It's kind of a nondescript building, and you go in, and it's like stepping back to the 70s.
Yeah.
Yeah, wanted to document that. We're all familiar with old buildings getting tore down and things disappearing. But another thing that happens is interiors get renovated. New owner takes over and decides, well, this 40-year-old decorations should go. And it can completely change. I've been to places like that where you go inside and it's just great, and you go back 2 years later and everything's modern, beige, gray.
Yeah.
So it's kind of important part of the project to document what the insides of these places look like too.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I can even relate to like a personal note where my favorite pizza bar in my college town had gone away for a couple years and then came back to a couple doors down from their original location, and it's just completely different from what it was just a couple years ago. And it used to be this good college bar kind of vibe, but even like normal people would go to it too, implying that college students are not normal people. But my friends and I refuse to go to the new one because it's just sterile. Like, it's very clean and clinical, and it's like, this isn't the $1 PBR, $4 giant slices of pizza that we know and love. This is a normal sit-down family restaurant with the same pizza recipes, but it's just not the right kind of presence. So my friends and I, of course, taken plenty of pictures in there, did some of my senior photos in there when I was in college, and I'm glad I have those at least. But it is important to document those kind of things, especially if it's a place that you are really personally connected with.
Speaking of everything going sterile, that's what I noticed going into a lot of these abandoned places that have been abandoned for 40, 50 years, is the colors on the wall are just wild. Like, sea foam green and pink and bright yellow. Makes me think we need to bring color back into this country. We've had enough, honestly, beige and gray and brown.
Yeah. It's kind of similar to cars too, where like there's, it's just white, gray, silver, or black, and there's really nothing else that you can get cars in these days. It's really sad. But anyway, so related to the to being connected with the people that you've worked with when taking these photographs, talking specifically about the portraits now, what was the working relationship like with the people that you took pictures with? Was it just kind of a quick and easy portrait, or were any of them like people like Jerry that showed you around a bit more and maintained a connection with for the extent of the project and beyond?
Yes. Yes to everything. Some of the people I've known for decades. There's a couple other people like Jerry that I didn't know, but now I know. Yeah, there's other people where it was just a brief encounter. Start talking to them, hey, do you mind if I get a photo? And that's kind of it. There was I think I sent photos to just about everybody, but most of them I never heard back from. But yeah, it was definitely a wide range. People I knew a lot, and people I knew for 10 minutes, and that was the extent of our relationship.
There was one person that I took a portrait of in Mount Olive, Illinois. He had his Yamaha motorcycle or something, and that was an interaction that I thought was going to be short. Mm-hmm. And I took 2 portraits of him, and that wound up being like a 45-minute conversation with the guy. It was just... Were there any times like that where you just had like what you thought was going to be quick and easy, and then wound up, oh, great, I'm stuck here for the next 2 hours. Like, I'm trapped in the Midwestern conversation.
Yeah, I don't think there's any photos in the book from any of those, but there was definitely a few times, where you get talking to somebody and they want to show you this and take you here, and do this, and it's kind of stuff you're not that interested in, but like,
Yeah.
well, I'll go along to be nice. And then it gets down to the end, and like, would you mind if I get a photo of you? No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
You know? And it's,
I did
you
all
know,
this for you.
Yeah, I mean, you get some of these guys that are just way more interested in something than you are, but you kind of go along to be nice, and
Yeah.
you're not that interested. But didn't happen a lot, but it happened a few times. But nothing from that ended up in the book.
Yeah, and it's always kind of a gamble of like, oh, maybe they will show me something that will result in a decent photograph.
Yeah, and that's happened too. Where you get somebody, I'll show you this, and you're like, well, okay. You go there, and then they're like, oh, I almost forgot about something over here, and then all of a sudden that's like, wow, amazing. I would have never known that if I said, oh, I'm not interested. So it can go both ways, and that's kind of what I found is the best thing about these photo trips is following threads. And maybe they'll go somewhere, maybe they won't. But it's, even if it turned out to not really be worth it, maybe it could have been. So
Exactly right.
if you have the time to do it, it's nice.
Yeah, and then through pretty much all of this work, at least for me, there's a lot of really familiar subject matters, either specific references to stores like Rural King, as well as, of course, the iconography that we talked about of like the grain elevators and railroads. So tell me about how you went about choosing what you were photographing, whether it was something that just was completely random in the field or something that you deliberately sought out for. What was that process like?
Sure. Yeah, Rural King had to go in a book.
Yep.
I purposely went to Rantoul, Illinois to shoot that Rural King.
In there.
And yeah, when I did live in southern Wisconsin, I had a friend that grew up in northern Illinois, and we were both interested in railroads photography. So like every weekend we'd go somewhere, usually in Illinois, northern Illinois, central Illinois, to see something. And one day he tells me, we're going to go to the greatest place on earth. And it was Rural King in Rantoul, Illinois.
It was not Fleet Farm.
No. Rural King is far more interesting. Go in there, and in like the toys or playground section, they had empty 55-gallon drums. Like, sure.
Yes.
And I remember his dad wanted us to pick him up a pair of jeans. So he bought him a pair of jeans, and he got it home, and he gets them out and looks at them and says, well, there's no belt loops on these. They forgot to put the belt loops on the pants. So I just felt like that should go in the book, but especially because of the name itself, Rural King. Mm-hmm. What a great name for a project like this. And then to top it all off, when I visited, they had in the windows this big sign that said Gun Barn. It was like that. Well, that doesn't get much more Midwestern than that. So if you're not from that Illinois area, you probably never heard of Rural King, but I thought it would be a perfect fit for the.
I didn't realize that it was a pretty much only Illinois Farm and Fleet kind of competitor of sort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, being from North Dakota, I'd never heard of it, but now I'm pretty familiar with it. I usually stop at one when I see one.
Yep.
But then other things like grain elevators and railroads, they just had to be a part of it because they are the Midwest. I mean, virtually every town has or had a grain elevator, and virtually every town was created by the railroads. Like Iowa especially. At one point in Iowa, you supposedly were never more than 12 miles from a railroad. The railroads built the Midwest, brought the people in, and then hauled out their agricultural products, from the grain elevator. There's quite a few abandoned places, but that's become the Midwest as well. As empties out, they become as much a part as the railroads and the grain elevators as empty buildings, empty houses.
Previous guest, actually one of the oldest guests from early on in the show, Brendan Burton, talked a bit about what he found during his travels, that especially places like Illinois, Missouri, and Iowa have a really surprisingly high number of abandoned homes, either because of, foreclosure or just family situations or anything like that. It's really fascinating, but there's also like a little bit of a archaeology hat that goes on in the moment of what could have possibly happened to the family or people that used to live in this house.
Yeah, definitely. You see plenty that are just completely empty, but every once in a while you come across one where there's furniture, kitchen utensils still in the drawer, maybe even a picture on a wall. And those are the ones you really wonder what happened. Why did nobody ever come back for any of this?
So with the work, what was the sprawl of this work? Like, how far from North Dakota did you wind up going to make this work?
Let's see, the furthest south I went was somewhere in central Oklahoma. It went as far west as kind of the foothills of the Rockies, central Montana, eastern Colorado. East, I got a little bit into Indiana. None of those pictures, I only made a couple, and none of those made it into the book. That was kind of the territory, and I don't know, I calculated the square mileage I covered once. And it was astonishing how huge of an area it really was. I knew it was a big area, but I didn't think it was that much. So, pretty big area of the Midwest and Great Plains region. The book is primarily the Midwest, but you could argue whether the Great Plains or Midwest. They're kind of that dividing line, but they're most certainly flyover country.
Exactly. Yeah. There was a book that I recently read by Richard Powers, The Echo Maker, that takes place in Nebraska. And something that a phrase that came up a lot in that book was the Great American Desert. And I'm like, I don't think it's talking about Arizona and New Mexico. So let's figure out this. I looked up the phrase, and it actually kind of refers to that corridor of the Great Plains and the eastern half of the Midwest. So basically like western Illinois over to basically the foothills of the Rockies. And that was considered the Great American Desert for a long time before Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada were more expansively settled in. So that was a really fascinating thing to think about the Great Plains as a kind of flat desert, as it kind of is of sort.
Yeah, and I know when some of the first people made their way out there and they saw it was all short grass and no trees, they just figured nothing was going to grow out there.
Yeah, turns out it's actually really good at growing things.
Yeah, that was another thing with the railroads to entice people, especially to the Great Plains region, eastern Montana, eastern Colorado. Rainfall was marginal. They got a professor somewhere to come up with a theory that if you plow up the ground, it'll create rain, so the rain will follow the plow. That theory didn't quite work out.
Yeah.
Which explains why there's a lot of abandoned places in that area, too.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, also leading into things like the Dust Bowl in the 30s. So, a lot of those things kind of line up. But there's a previous guest of the show, the first of the kind of comeback tour of sort for the show, Epiphany Nedler is from the other Dakota, the one below you. And her work in Wish You Were Here focused a lot on the tourist culture, especially focusing on wall drug as one of the most prominent subjects. So while you were out traveling, what were some of your observations of the tourist culture in a lot of these rural areas? Because I can remember it's always kind of a funky and kind of fun thing to experience when out in these little towns. So what was your experience like with that?
Yeah, there's a lot of little towns with really strange attractions, I guess you would call that.
Yeah.
Remember, some town in Iowa has the world's largest frying pan. North Dakota, 2 different towns have 2 different turtles. One giant turtle made out of wheel rims, and one of a giant turtle riding snowmobile. The biggest ball of twine is in Minnesota. So yeah, you see a lot of this stuff usually developed by some local kind of eclectic. It does seem kind of like, they're trying to get people to come to town, but I don't know if it's really working.
Yeah.
Most of these sites I visited, I was the only one there. So it might draw some people to town, but I get the feeling they come in, take a photo, take a selfie, leave. and don't
Yeah.
stick around to shop at the hardware store. To make a destination on these trips, sometimes that's what I would try to find is something weird, the world's largest this or whatever, just to have a place to go rather than just completely wandering. And so that would kind of draw me to the town. I'd go look at it, hope maybe somebody was there I could get a photo of, but there usually wasn't.
Yeah.
But then I'd start to go explore the town itself and find other things that might be interesting that I wouldn't have seen if I hadn't gone to see the biggest frying pan.
So in a sense, those things worked for you, but may not have worked for other people, but in a different way.
Yeah, they worked for me, but yeah, they got me there. But I'd considered photographing some of these things, but is kind of a whole other project in itself, really. There's one photo that didn't make it in the book. They took somewhere in Illinois, and it was one of those blue interstate signs, that they put up by the exits, gas, it tells you the gas stations, the food. I had one that said attractions, but there's nothing on the sign. It just said attractions, and it was a blank sign.
I actually drove past one of those yesterday up in New Hampshire. So
Okay, so it's not just a Midwest thing.
yeah. I mean, New Hampshire, people call it the South of the North, but I'd argue it's more the Wisconsin of the Northeast because it is. First of all, Vermont and New Hampshire have the second best cheese in the country, mostly Vermont than New Hampshire. But like the landscape is way more mountainous, but the culture and the land, like the developed landscape, the actual towns and everything feels so much more like, oh, I'm in, Wisconsin, I'm in Door County or something like that. It sometimes feels like that. So it's kind of fun seeing things like that. And it feels the closest to home up there than like down here on the South Coast of Massachusetts. So, of course, most of the Midwest is associated with farming and small towns that we've talked about a lot. I still feel a really deep connection to my hometown, Bloomington, even though I'm 1,100 miles away from it. Do you feel that your area of North Dakota keeps that inspiration going for you to keep making work about it? Or have you found interest in also expanding beyond that and even so much as hyper-focusing on somewhere that you're not super familiar with?
North Dakota's always been my favorite place to photograph. But yeah, I did this driving through flyover country project, which took me to a huge area. And it was fun to visit all that. But once I was done, I kind of felt like, well, I wouldn't mind just focusing on North Dakota.
Yeah.
So I've actually kind of shrunk, for now anyway, the area that I'm focusing on and just really trying to get as much as I can of my home state and the area I live. It still inspires me to go out and shoot every day, or not every day, but whenever I can, something about the area. And I think some of it's just, I feel like I have an obligation to capture it when it's there. Like I always feel like, well, it's going to change, it's going to disappear. I need to get out and capture it while I can. But I still do really enjoy going other places and photographing some. I spent a lot of time in Kansas the last couple of years photographing. Isn't that much different than North Dakota, but at the same time, completely different.
Yeah, there's similar shapes.
Yeah.
One's a little bit colder.
I still usually make a big trip somewhere every year, but it's not necessarily strictly photos. And it's neat to see places and do some photography, but I always feel at home when I get home with the camera. So yeah, I've actually kind of shrunken for now my area of focus.
Yeah, which that's kind of I can relate a bit as well because my thesis work was sprawling a lot of the country from up here in Northeast to the Midwest to the Southwest, the other one, and that was like really super big, and it was always because I have family in all three places. And like nowadays, I've been focusing in on specifically Central Illinois and specifically on Southern New England as like kind of separate endeavors. And that hyper focus after doing a really big sprawling project, I think, is a nice refresher of sort to keep your brain working right.
Seems like that's how it goes for a lot of photographers. Is we start out and some of the favorite books we look at are giant areas, giant road trips type books. It's sort of like, well, we kind of want to do that. And then when you get into it, you realize this is a lot to try and do. So as you progress as a photographer, it seems like you focus in a little more and more and more to a specific thing or a specific region. Notice that with a lot of photographers, including myself, where jump into it, you want to go really big, and then as you get more mature, that space gets a little smaller and more focused.
Exactly, yeah. And you kind of learn how to tell a story of whether it's like a specific location that you're telling a story about, or a kind of conceptual narrative, and like how can you use what's available in your local area to make something conceptual versus something very much specific about the location, both of which are really effective. Like some of my favorite books kind of do both. Like I just got Christian Patterson's Bottom of the Lake. Absolutely unbelievable book. And it's got the sound part that's part of it, but it's about Fond du Lac, but it's also kind of about other things. It's freaking incredible. And it's a facsimile of his family's old phone book from Fond du Lac from like 1974, I think. And it was the same phone book his family had for a while, and there's a bunch of little doodles and highlights and circles in there. He added in a few new ones, I'm pretty sure. But then he inserted new photographs as well as found photographs and objects into it. And it's this really incredible story about Fond du Lac, but also about kind of connection and also like the big picture of like media of sort too. So some jabs at Nixon as well, considering the time period. So those are always welcomed. But anyway, so
did you call the phone number that he provides with that book?
I did, yes. And it is when the first time that I looked through it with one of my best friends, we called it once. And like, okay, that was kind of interesting. I don't really know what's going on there. So then we called it again, and then again, and then at a certain point, him and I are just like staring at each other, jaws dropped, like, this is so fucking cool. So yes.
Yeah, that was, yeah. What amazes me is the phone number still works. But it's
almost 10 years later, it still works.
Yeah.
Someone's paying for that phone bill.
Yeah. Sometimes at work, I'll put on speakerphone and dial that number and just let it play. And get really strange looks.
Tell me about any of your most memorable trips that you had while working on the project.
Yeah, that trip meeting Jerry, obviously. I kind of talked about that. Another one, though, was a guy named Jim in Cresco, Iowa. And in the book, it's the older guy in a red sweater standing on a red caboose. Yeah, it was for whatever. Somehow ended up in Cresco, Iowa, looking for something to shoot, and heard about a place called the Norman Borlaug Boyhood Farm, and I had no idea who Norman Borlaug was. Later, I learned about him, and he was an agronomist that developed a strain of wheat that was high yield, resistance to disease, and it was dwarf. So if you're not familiar with the farming term of lodged wheat, what happens is stems get so tall that heavy rain or wind knocks it over and it's hard to harvest. It can actually rot on the ground. So he developed this brand new strain of wheat that kind of revolutionized wheat production in the world. And this is one of the many things he did in agriculture. He actually won a Nobel Prize for his work in agriculture. Wow. But the farm he grew up on is near Cresco, and it's kind of a museum, kind of a replication of what the house looked like when he grew up. And I drove out there and it was closed, but the house was kind of interesting, so I was photographing the exterior of the house, and this guy named Jim showed up, and he was hauling out scrap lumber from some project they had done there. And I got talking to him and told him, what I was working on, and somehow brought up the fact that I worked for a railroad. He said, well, I'm interested in that, and come to find out, he's got a barn on his farm that's just full of railroad memorabilia and artifacts and stuff. So he says, you should come see it. And He's got this barn, he's got a miniature railroad that runs, but then this strangest thing he had was this Soviet-made narrow-gauge steam engine, really small railroad steam engine. Somehow he found and bought after the fall of the USSR and had shipped to his farm in Iowa. And it doesn't run, but it's pretty neat.
Yeah, honestly.
It's like, who would think you'd come to a farm in Iowa and find a Soviet steam engine? Yeah, one of those experiences where you don't know what to expect, but it ends up being really cool. So I took some photos with him with the steam engine, but they weren't all that great. And then he had this home-built caboose, too, and had him go stand on that and got his portrait, and that's what ended up in the book. But that was just one of those things where you're just kind of bored looking for something to do, and it ends up, following a thread, and all of a sudden you're standing next to a guy with a Soviet steam engine in a barn.
Sometimes those are the best kinds of trips, honestly.
Yeah, I wish you could. That's one of the things that drives you to do these trips is hoping you find something like that, and so often it doesn't happen, but I guess that's what keeps driving you to do it.
Yeah. It goes back to that gamble improvisation kind of thing we talked about. So to continue talking about the book, tell me a little bit about what working with Noah at Subjectively Objective was like for this book. I've got a handful of their publications, and I really love the way that he makes these things happen, the way that he curates them. So tell me about what your experience for this book was.
The way it came about was I was kind of winding up this project and kind of, feeling it was gone far enough. So I always thought it would be a book somehow. I just didn't know how. So I kind of made a book dummy out of it just to see what it looked like, and it was okay. So I shared it to social media, and I'd have pictures in most of Noah's what you call them, collaborative curated books, going back to the one you mentioned earlier. So he was familiar with my work. So he saw this book dummy I did, came to me and said, yeah, I thought this would actually be an interesting book. Would you be interested in doing it with Subjectively Objective? And of course, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great. So ended up sending him all the photos I took from the project. And then I also sent him, I think, one of the sequences I did. So he spent some time with it and put together a new sequence and new pairings and photos I hadn't used, and some that I had he took out and sent it back to me. And we kind of went back and forth a little bit, tweaking this and that, until we came up with something we liked. But most of the sequencing was Noah's work. He's really good at that. So he came up with combinations and sequences I would have never thought of, but they worked really well. So say most of the sequencing is the work of Noah with maybe a little contribution from myself here and there.
Yeah.
So we got the sequence down and, worked on figuring out what size, cover. There's a lot of stuff you don't think of that goes into making these books.
Yeah.
And then the COVID pandemic hit, and that kind of slowed everything way down. All of a sudden, there's supply chain problems. I think one of the printers actually closed and went out of business.
Yeah.
And just, there's personal things that came up as a result of the pandemic. And something we'd hoped to have done in 6 months ended up taking quite a bit longer. But, thanks to Noah and his hard work and keeping at it and working with printers, and we eventually got the book out. So basically I took the photos and Noah did all the hard work.
Yeah.
There's just so much technical detail that goes into producing a book that if you don't know what you're doing, you wouldn't even know where to start. And he knows how to do all that on top of being a fantastic curator. That's how kind of how the book came together. It took longer than we'd hoped, but it was worth it in the end.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks to Noah for wanting to do it and putting in lots of time to put it together.
Yep. So, briefly talking about the sequence, it kind of puts you into this. It kind of puts you like just in the middle of your sprawl that you're in. Just kind of plops you down there into this vast space. There's no kind of easing way into it. It's just kind of you're there. So, do you perceive this book as like a first-person kind of personal journey, or was this more of a separated, much more toward that documentary style that we talked about?
Yeah, it's definitely got a documentary part to it. As it came together, and as I looked at the book, I thought of it more as a journey through the space. When I kind of think about trips I've gone on, I don't remember them linearly. Like I started here and then saw this and saw this. I remember like fragments here, fragment here, and they don't necessarily match up with the trip you were on. But they contribute to remembering the place or the trip as a whole. So this book is non-linear. It doesn't stay in one location and move to another. It's like kind of look at it as like remembering a trip through the Midwest or flyover country, where you remember parts here, parts there. They all come together to contribute a whole picture of the place.
Yeah.
As remembered. So it's not a strict documentary. This happened. This happened. This happened. It does document the place, but it's kind of a non-linear. Memories of places you were and how they come together.
Yeah, I like that that perspective of using memory as a kind of tool for it, for something that is more toward documentary work, but that memory aspect I think is a really interesting way of like bouncing through, because we don't really have very many specific references to locations. Like there's the Sabin, Minnesota elevator. Mm-hmm. We'll get it, as well as the town Hannah, which is that South Dakota, North Dakota? Is that even in one of the Dakotas?
Yeah, North Dakota.
North Dakota. Okay,
it's 2 miles south of Canada.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Specific references to places is not super common, but is when it's there. Sometimes it's just the name of the town, but no state. So like it really does kind of have this amorphous, like we know we're in the Midwest, but specifically where there's only a couple times where we're kind of anchored somewhere. And I think that works really well with that memory aspect that you're talking about. Even if the memory side of things is not like a deliberate visual tool, it's kind of implied with that, which I really like about that.
It's a documentary, but it's meant to capture the feel of a place. So you kind of get a little of both. There is location captions in the back. But
yes, of course.
That of course keeps things separated.
Yeah, that's what I wound up doing as well, is I wanted to have the places in my thesis book, but I needed them to be kind of separated. And I did accidentally put New York instead of Illinois for one of the towns, and I will never forgive myself for it. It's the only typo in the whole book. So tell me a bit about the essay with your old teacher, Wayne Gudmundsson, in the back of the book.
Yeah, a little bit about Wayne. Is primarily a landscape photographer. And he primarily works in North Dakota, but he's done work elsewhere as well, and primarily in black and white, although he has shot some color. But he's been working at least since the late 70s. His first project was documenting the second oil boom in North Dakota, which was the early 80s. And him and his wife and another person, they put together a book on that. And since then, he's published several books that look at landscapes, failed canal project from the Pick Sloan project, German-Russian Iron Crosses, and then his heritage is Icelandic, so he has a book that compares the connection between Iceland and the Icelandic settlers in North Dakota. And a landscape photographer, but not in a traditional landscape sense. He's interested in man-altered landscape.
Yeah.
So he's been at it a while. He has a really good connection to North Dakota in the Midwest. And like I said, he was my professor in college. He's since retired, but still photographs. And we've kept in touch, and I told him about the project and asked him if he'd be willing to write a little something for it. So I sent him PDFs of the book, and he looked at them and was able to ask me a couple questions and wrote that wonderful little essay that I think perfectly captures what I was going for in the project. And he also provided that Fred Eaglesmith quote at the beginning of the book. So yeah, with his connection to the landscape and knowing, the region, it was like a perfect choice to have him write the essay for it.
Yeah. I think that there's a lot of times where there is a battle with oneself about whether or not to include a supplemental essay or something, whether it's your own or from someone else. And I think like having someone that's really familiar with that kind of like that landscape and everything just obviously is like, especially since you have that background with him, that it's just the right person. I wound up going with someone with a sound art and photography background for my thesis. And now, one thing that I remember from when I was at a portfolio review in the past, that someone was looking at some of my Midwestern work and just saw a lot of cornfields, and they're saying like they just kind of sighed and said, "You got to stop taking pictures of cornfields; it's so overdone." And of course, they had spent some time in the Midwest, and they are not from the Midwest, but they had spent enough time here to kind of get tired of the flatness that we're familiar with. So as a fellow obsessive of pictures of open fields and things like that, do you think that you could ever exhaust the subject of that openness?
Maybe, but probably not. Because there's always something changing. It goes back to talking about growing up on a farm and how light changes through the day, changes through the seasons, the landscape itself changes through the seasons. And if you're looking for little subtleties, the pictures can be endless of these open fields, because they can look completely different in winter and summer, and they can look completely different in the morning and the afternoon.
Yep.
They're not static, unchanging cornfields. There's always something changing. So I don't know that I could exhaust that, but definitely might edit down what I have.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it reminds me of the professor emeritus from my undergrad. I never got to study with him, but Rondell McKinney taught at Illinois State University. I think he graduated, of sort, technically did, retired in, I think, 2015 or 14, and he almost exclusively for a long time photographed just deadpan photographs of cornfields. He did more beyond that, but he was known for the cornfields work. He still does it today, just a lot less frequently. But what was really interesting is when I was visiting his studio with a class, he had two 8x10 contact prints. One was shot in the 80s and one was shot like a month before we visited. And they looked like the same. And that was a really fascinating experience, seeing that he does have photos that show that progression of, say, the new windmills being put in, or new architecture, a specific new design for elevators or whatever, that really kind of tells you those time things. But then there are other moments where like, oh, these are of the same field 40 years apart, and you can't tell. And I think that is a really interesting thing that can happen with this landscape that we're familiar with.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Changes, but it stays the same. Yeah,
exactly. So where can people find your work online?
They can visit my website, lewisableidinger.com. I can spell that out, or it might be easier to look it up.
it'll be in the show notes, so no worry about the spelling on there.
Yeah, it's kind of an unfortunate last name in terms of spelling, but lewisableidinger.com. And then I'm on Instagram as l.ableidinger. So the letter of my first name, period, my last name.
Yeah. All of which will be linked down there in the show notes, so I can relate to the odd last name, though maybe not quite to the same extent, but I definitely get some pretty funky spellings. Usually people add an L in there and like that ain't right. But it's a fun time having a unique last name, honestly. Keeps us on our toes.
There's no confusing you with somebody else.
Exactly. I know there's one other Jeff Smoody that works in Wisconsin. Is probably a distant cousin, because my family did settle in like north central Wisconsin in Colby area, which is an area that I've been wanting to photograph for a long time. And damn it, I got to get some real Colby cheese from the city it's named for. I got to do it. It's one of my favorite cheeses. If there's anything that people take away from this, it's you got to believe people when they say Wisconsin has the best cheese. All right, just go to literally any town. If you're in Milwaukee, if you're in Eau Claire, I don't care. Just get yourself some real Wisconsin cheese from a city there. That's all I care about in this episode, people. Ignore everything that we just talked about.
Yeah.
Just focus on that. The important things in life. Anyway, Lewis, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm really looking forward to seeing how your new work is going.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks so much for having me. I'm glad you're interested in my work enough to have you on the show. I've been enjoying listening to previous episodes. So.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, folks. And that does it for this one. So I will see you all in the next one.
Thank you for listening to Ready for Mistakes. This series of interviews is entirely self-produced and self-funded and would not be possible without the generosity of guests' time and willingness to participate. If you would like to support the show, I will not take your money, and instead I ask you to subscribe and follow on our various social media profiles, and of course to share it with your friends. Do you want to come on the show and discuss your work? Submit to the form in the show notes and put your name in the hat. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one.